Chapter 16. After talking to Faith that day, Kaylyn went back to Matthew's place. As soon as she was about to open the door to the house, her phone rang. She placed it to her ear, answering. "Hello," casually, since she was oblivious of whom it was. "Hello, Miss Fisher, it's Jason Felix," came the reply, and Kaylyn felt her heart pick up its pace suddenly. Hello, she couldn't resist the stutter. She wasn't expecting the call. "Are you okay?" he asked after moments' pause. "I'm fine. Thanks for asking," she said, moving away from the door and to a more private area, the garden. "Not a problem." He trailed off. "I'm just calling to confirm for Monday," he said, a bit hopefully. Without hesitation, she answered a cheerful yes. And then she cleared her throat. "Yes, I'll definitely be there," she replied in a more calm tone. He chuckled lightly. "Okay then, good. Be here at 8, he exclaimed. Kaylyn was grinning. "I'll be there." "Thank you. See you then," he concluded before hanging up the phone. Kaylyn was over the moon. As soon as she started working, she would be out of this place and back to her own life. She whispered a small thank you to the heavens before she moved in the direction of the house. Upon hearing a car being parked outside, Matthew moved towards the window, curious to find out who it was. He thought it to be Kaylyn, and he was right. He watched as she stiffly moved towards the entrance, and he stood there, waiting for the door to burst open so he could lecture her on arriving so late. It was almost 7 p.m. and he found it hard to believe that she would stay away so late, considering she left about 3 hours earlier. Why would she stay out so late, being pregnant? He was angered by her carelessness, but he would soon find his answers in due time. Waiting, Matthew realized that the door didn't open and Kaylyn didn't enter, but instead, she had moved around the side, towards the garden with her phone at her ear. Curiosity got the better of him, as always, and so he found himself wandering to the other room, where he would see and probably hear what was going on. He watched, and although she was speaking in a hushed tone, Matthew picked up a few words when excitement got the better of her, causing her voice to ring out. "Yes," he heard her squeal. "Yes, I'll definitely be there," she said, and he could see that she was trying to speak softer, but he was still able to hear due to the excitement in her voice. He wondered where she would be and what for, but whatever it was, he planned on finding out soon. He moved to the door, when he saw that the phone call had ended. He stood, arms crossed, waiting for the door to open, and that it did. Kaylyn gasped when she opened the door to find Matthew standing there, arms crossed like he was an angry father and she, the child who had arrived home late. Snorting, she stepped past him, denying him the one thing she knew he wanted most, answers. She moved towards the stairs, but paused when he spoke. "Well, aren't you going to say anything?" he demanded from behind, and Kaylyn couldn't resist smiling. She knew it was coming. She turned to face him, after putting on a stern expression. "I told you I was going out." "What else do you want to know?" she asked, cocking her brow. "I want to know why you are coming here so late," he demanded crisply. Kaylyn gawked at him. The man was truly unbelievable. "If you are going to have a problem with me going out, well, you should just let me go back home then," she exclaimed in a suggestive manner. Matthew snorted. "No way in hell. Then don't question me about my whereabouts next time and mind the business that pays you." She gave a stiff, mirthless smile before she padded off to her room. "Wait." Matthew called out, and Kaylyn paused. Turning around, she answered, "Yes?" "Who were you on the phone with?" he asked bluntly, and Kaylyn huffed out a breath in disbelief, before rolling her eyes. "Are you serious?" she spat, then stomped to her room, furious at Matthew for being so damn inquisitive. As soon as she reached her room, she sat on the bed and dialed Faith's number. "Hey, you okay?" Faith asked as soon as she answered. Kaylyn smiled. "Yes, I'm great. I got the job," she squealed. "I know that. You told me, remember," she said slowly, as if she was talking to a mentally slow person. Kaylyn giggled. Yes, but I thought that, after finding out that I'm carrying Matthew's child, he would lose interest or something, she shrugged. I told you, you didn't have to worry about that personal matter, she injected slowly. The guy's not a douche like Mayhew, she completed matter-of-factly. Yeah, well now I know. Anyway, I'll talk to you later. I'm going to bed, she suddenly yawned. Aight, see you when I see you, she exclaimed before disconnecting the call. Kaylyn sighed and plopped down on the bed, closing her eyes when the soft, cushiony surface of the bed came in contact with her tired form. Her mind wandered off to the way her life had been a few months ago. In a job that only paid enough to pay the bills and buy food, with a man who had the IQ of a fish, no offense to Nemo intended. She didn't know if her life now was better than before. She would now be in a job that would set her on her feet, financially, but she wasn't happy with her living situation. The shrilling of her cell phone woke Kaylyn from the doze she had seemingly slipped into. She immediately bolted upwards, a bit frightened. Releasing a groan, she picked up her phone and her brows wrinkled when she gazed at the unknown caller ID. Groggily, she answered, "Hello." There was a short pause. "Kaylyn, it is your father, Patrick," came the firm, familiar voice, and Kaylyn froze at the spot she was in, dumbfounded. Chapter 17. Before Kaylyn could form a reply, 1,000 thoughts floated through her head, but there was one that was grating on her brain. Why was he calling her? He hadn't called in years. Clearing her throat, she also wondered by what she would address him. Dad or Patrick? Yes, hi, she said instead, not wanting to make the conversation more awkward than it was, what it was going to be. There was a tiny pause, and in that moment Kaylyn found herself biting her nails. She hadn't realized, but she was nervous. She was really nervous, and it came as a bit of a surprise to her. "How are you?" came Patrick's aristocratic tone, and Kaylyn inwardly cringed. The tone had been so familiar, so frustrating, that hearing it now brought back a load of memories she would rather leave in the past. "I'm fine." She straightened her shoulders, swallowing hard. "Kaylyn, I know that we don't always." He trailed off and chuckled. "In fact, we never see eye to eye, but you're still my daughter." "You never acted like a father," she blurted, a thought she wanted to be silent but her heart wanted it to be heard. Kaylyn, however, did not regret the outburst. It was the truth. Patrick cleared his throat. "I know. I know what I did was wrong. I should have been more of a father to you, but I'm trying to change that now, dash." "It's too late," she snapped. "Kaylyn, I'm not well, and I'm trying to make amends. In this short time, I'm trying to take back what I lost," he reasoned. Kaylyn's throat constricted. His words took her by surprise. "You're trying to make things right now that you're supposedly dying?" "And what if you weren't?" she asked, her voice heavy with emotions. Kate dash. "No," she hissed. "No. Where were you when I needed a father by my side? I didn't have the support of the two people I expected it from the most at the time." I to dash her voice broke, but she swallowed and most at the time. I to dash her voice broke, but she swallowed and continued. "I told you what was happening to me, and you told me I was a liar." "You believed him over your own daughter," she exclaimed brokenly, tears now spilling from her eyes. She blocked out that part of her life, but now her father's call crumpled all the walls she had worked so hard in building over the years. "I don't give a damn if you're dying. And I don't see the need for your call. I hope you enjoy the time you have left," she exclaimed shakily, but firm enough to get her words across. With shaky fingers she disconnected the call and broke down in sobs. She curled herself up in a ball on the bed and cried. She had to admit, a little kindle of hope spurred in her body when she had heard it was he who was calling. Although the spark was small, deep down she felt a bit happy, but after finding that his only reason was because he was a dying man, that spark died and coldness formed in her heart. She had gone through a lot, with and without the abomination she called parents, and though she may have sounded harsh, she held no regrets. Her words were subtle in comparison to theirs over the past years. She cried until she hiccuped, her tears making a sea of sadness on the bed sheets, unbeknownst to her that Matthew, as always, was lurking out of sight. Matthew had only ventured upstairs and to Kaylyn's room, with the intention of an apology. He had earlier pondered on his words and he had realized that he was wrong for his patriarchal interrogation. He paused at the door when he heard her on the phone, and a part of him wanted to leave, to give her privacy, but another part, the very inquisitive and nosy side, wanted so much more to just stay and listen. He decided on the latter. He stayed. As he leaned against the outer wall of her room, his brows perked up when he heard the one-sided conversation that was taking place. At first, he didn't know whom she was talking to, but he later found out that it was her father. From Matthew's point of view, it was clear to see that the relationship between the two was not a good one. He stiffened when he heard Kaylyn's sniffs, which indicated that she was crying. She was hurt. He heard it in her voice. He heard it in the words she spoke. Something happened. Someone did something to her. Her parents didn't believe her and they shunned her. That much was clear to Matthew, and it caused an unidentifiable emotion to form in his heart. He didn't know if it was dislike for the strangers or possessiveness towards Kaylyn. Maybe it was both or none at all. After a while, he didn't hear her talking, but he could clearly hear her sobs. Little hiccups came in between and Matthew couldn't resist grabbing the doorknob. He pushed the door open and paused in his tracks when he saw Kaylyn curled up on the bed, crying. He wasn't a fan of crying women. He would normally leave them to cry by themselves, but he couldn't resist this time. This time, he wanted to comfort this crying woman, and so he found himself moving towards a crying Kaylyn Fisher. He sat beside her on the bed and placed a hand on her trembling shoulders. He realized how she stiffened at his touch, but the tears racking her body was too much to control and so she gave in. Matthew was glad when she didn't protest and he used that opportunity to offer her more. Pulling her in his arms, she rested her head against his chest and enveloped her with his hands. He could feel the warm, wet liquid soaking through his shirt, but he didn't mind. He massaged the nape of her neck and gently hushed her. She felt so tiny in his arms. The right fit. Soon, her sniffs were no more, but the tears created a tattoo of sadness down her cheeks. "Kaylyn?" he said, but he didn't get a reply. Matthew leaned his head to look at her, and then realized she was asleep. He smiled and gently placed her down on the bed, pulling the sheets over her. He stood and watched her. Watched the way her fiery hair spilled behind her, creating a silken sea. Her features softened, her lashes creating shadows on her face. She looked even more beautiful than before, if that was even possible, Matthew thought. "Daddy, is Kaylyn okay?" a voice whispered from behind and Matthew turned, looking down on the concerned face of his daughter. Smiling, he moved towards her and scooped her in his arms. "She will be," he kissed her on the forehead, gently caressing her small back. "She doesn't look okay. Can I sleep beside her?" Sapphire asked with pleading eyes. Matthew shook his head, "No," suddenly. "No honey, I'm sure Kaylyn wants to be alone now," he tried to explain, but Sapphire was still pouting. She didn't say anything else, but when Matthew tucked her in bed that night, she snuck back out and wandered into Kaylyn's room, lying silently beside her. Patrick sighed heavily when Kaylyn disconnected the call. He messed up pretty badly, again. He hadn't intended on using his sickness as leverage to win her over, but the conversation had started off poorly, so on impulse, he had blurted it out. He made mistakes in the past, and he was saddened by the fact that this was the time he had decided on making amends. He messed up pretty badly, but he planned on making things right before he took his last dying breath. "Patrick honey, are you all right?" his wife, Lilith asked, stepping into the room. He felt guilty looking at her, because he still had not told her about his sickness. He was waiting on the right time, but later found out that there was no such thing. "I'm fine," he smiled, deciding to turn the conversation in a different direction. Clearing his throat, he continued. "Lilith, wouldn't you say it's time for some reconciliation with our daughter?" he asked, suddenly cringing, because he knew it was a hard question for her. Lilith stopped in her tracks and turned to stare at Patrick with a perfectly arched brow. "What daughter?" she asked blankly. Patrick sighed, then coughed. "Come on, Dash." "No. We don't have a daughter," she cut in sharply. "Our daughter would not tell such a lie on someone. That slut, I assume you are referring to, holds no relation to this family," she completed harshly. Patrick only shook his head and Lilith used that opportunity to continue. "Now, our dear friend Catherine says that her engagement party is weekend coming, so I think we should have your suit ordered, before it's too late," she said, then left the room. Chapter 18. Kaylyn woke up the following morning, almost springing from the bed, when she saw or rather, who was beside her. She had to stifle the gasp that formed in the back of her throat because she was surprised to see Sapphire laying there. A slow smile split her face when she got a hold of herself and stared at the sleeping baby girl. Both her small hands were beneath her head and an innocent face rested above with her dark hair. Kaylyn smiled and slowly eased herself from the bed. She yawned and rubbed the sleep from her eyes, after which she glanced towards the small clock on the side table. It was 6:30 a.m. She sat up on the bed and stared blankly ahead, her thoughts taking her back to the conversation she had with her father. She stiffened instantly, her throat burning at the memory. "Hey, are you okay now?" she heard Sapphire's voice from behind and she couldn't resist smiling. "I am," she said, turning towards her, with a convincing smile on her face. Sapphire returned a grin. "Are you angry at me for sleeping with you?" she asked in a saddened tone, her voice groggy from sleep. Kaylyn gently placed a hand on her cheek, caressing gently. "Not at all. I think the fact that an angel slept beside me made me sleep better," she reassured, and Sapphire smiled sweetly. "You can go back to sleep if you're not ready to get up," she continued after seeing her droopy eyes. "Where are you going?" she yawned. "Work," Kaylyn told her, pulling the covers over Sapphire's chest. "Oh," was all she could manage to say before sleep consumed her once again. Kaylyn smiled, watching as Sapphire's eyes fluttered. It was evident that she didn't want to succumb to the will of her body, but she couldn't do much to fight it. Kaylyn was just about to head out of the room, when her door burst open, frightening her. She gasped, staring at Matthew, who stood there with wide eyes and a groggy expression on his face. "Sapphire's not in her room." "I don't." He trailed off, raking his fingers through his hair. "I left her in there last night," he exclaimed in hysteria, and it was pretty clear to see that his concern for his daughter was threatening to overwhelm him. Kaylyn also noticed that one small fact and she smiled, realizing that the very tough and aristocratic Matthew Mayhew had a weak spot. She stepped aside and pointed towards her bed, where Sapphire laid beneath the covers in a cuddly ball of innocence. Kaylyn glanced from Sapphire and leveled her gaze at Matthew. She watched the relief that overcame him, softening his features and taking away the lines of tension from his face. She watched the bobbing of his Adam's apple as he swallowed and the love that swam in his eyes as he glanced at his sleeping daughter. He turned to Kaylyn so quickly that she didn't get the chance to cast her gaze from him, and so he caught her staring at him with admiration. Kaylyn quickly cleared her throat and awkwardly looked away, fidgeting with her fingers. "It seems like she really likes you. I told her she couldn't stay here last night, so she must have snuck out of her room to come here," Matthew quickly said, not wanting to make the situation more awkward by dwelling in silence. As soon as the words left his lips, Kaylyn wanted to squirm, her thoughts taking her back to the previous night. She immediately remembered crying on Matthew's shoulders in his arms. She was reminded of the way he comforted her, gently caressing her shoulders as he held her close as if holding on to life itself. She knew she must have been really vulnerable at the time, because she would never, in her right mind, willingly fall into Matthew's arms. "Are you okay?" Matthew asked when he did not get a reply from her. Kaylyn was suddenly brought back to the present. "Erwaia," the words tumbled from her lips in a clutter of uncertainty. He was directly in front of her, willing her nose to notice the muskiness of the cologne that had created a permanent scent on his robe, the robe that hung loosely around him with a loose knot at the waist. Her eyes slowly traveled upwards, resting on the dark curls, peeking out of the cottony material that made permanent residence on the broadness of his chest. Kaylyn gulped almost audibly, taken aback by the way her body was responding to the sight of him. It seemed like her body had supposedly missed the feel of him, and last night had only reminded her of how it felt to be in his arms. How it felt to be held by him. She still remembered sweeping kisses along the plain-like hardness of his chest, and she still remembered him doing the same. Although her senses were slightly distorted at the time, she remembered the fine and very intimate details of their lovemaking, which took place months ago. She swallowed, suddenly feeling hot at the memory, but a voice in the back of her head suddenly reminded her that it had been a mistake. That would never happen again, and she was a fool for even remembering that it did, but how could she not remember, when there was a very permanent and evident proof of it? "Why are you up so early, by the way?" Matthew asked, curiosity knitting his brows. Kaylyn sighed heavily. The very question that she'd hope he didn't ask was the one he did. She trailed off, wondering how she'd break the news to him. "I'm going to work," she said the last few words quickly. "What work?" Matthew asked, a brow shooting up with curiosity. "At Felix Enterprises," she said now, moving towards the small closet. Matthew snorted, following behind. "The hell you are!" he exclaimed firmly. Kaylyn only rolled her eyes, pulling out a suit she had earlier planned on wearing. "You are not working there," Matthew continued in a no-nonsense tone. "Well, it isn't really your decision to make, is it?" she fired back. "You have to be crazy if you think you'll work during pregnancy," Matthew spat. "Call me stupid," she retorted flatly. Matthew raked a hand through his hair in frustration. "Why are you so goddamned stubborn? Why are you so goddamned bossy?" she bit back sharply. He sighed. "Okay, just listen to me please. You need the rest. You're not 100% healthy, you can't risk anything," he reasoned, lowering his tone. "I'm fine, and I won't sit in one place being dependent on you. I have to have something for myself and my child," she exclaimed in the same tone. "I can give you both everything you need. There's no need to work. You can maybe work when the baby turns a toddler." Kaylyn choked out a mirthless laugh. "Didn't you hear what I just said?" she asked in disbelief. Matthew ignored her. "What can I do to change your mind?" he sighed. "Nothing," came her decision, and Matthew pinched his nose, knowing that he would have to try something apart from talking Kaylyn out of the absurd decision. Chapter 19. Matthew watched in disbelief as Kaylyn scurried from the room and into the bathroom. He was so furious at the moment that he supported the numbness in his body because he didn't want to risk doing or saying something that would worsen the situation. The woman was so damned stubborn that he found it unbelievable. He didn't know what else to say that might change her mind. Hell, he didn't think anything would change her goddamned mind, but he knew he had to do something. Anything? Jesus Christ, he was going to be a madman before the baby was due. At the shrilling tone of his cell phone, Matthew hissed and briskly walked from Kaylyn's room and to his room where the phone was. He cocked a brow before answering, the caller ID taking him by surprise. "Catherine, hi," he answered in a cool tone, not betraying any signs of his irritation towards Kaylyn. "Hello Matthew. How are you?" came her velvety reply. "I'm fine," Matthew managed a stiff smile, even though it could not be seen. He wanted the woman to hurry along with the conversation already. After hearing that, "I'm fine," was all Matthew planned on saying, and not, "I'm fine, how are you?" Catherine cleared her throat and continued. "Well, I'm just calling to let you know that my parents are hosting a dinner party this weekend. You're invited, along with..." She trailed off, wanting Matthew to think that the words she was going to say next would hurt her to the core, but that was a part of her very devious plan. "Kaylyn," she completed in a broken tone, smiling on the other end with the way she sounded. Matthew took a moment to process the information he had just heard, and when it registered, he said, "We won't be coming, sorry." "Matthew, a lot of business personnel will be attending this party, and personal issues aside, I think it will be good for your professional growth," she reasoned convincingly. Matthew knew that it was somewhat true, but he also sensed that something about it wasn't right. The Bells were famous for their dinner parties, and that part wasn't strange, but Kaylyn doesn't have to come, he pointed out, and it was true. If Catherine had vowed to be so revengeful after their breakup, then he couldn't risk anything, especially at her parents' dinner party. Catherine had made a promise to ensure his misery, and Matthew knew she was a determined woman, hence why he wasn't buying her load of bull. "You will need an escort," she told him, and he flinched, knowing that much was true, but still. "Look, I know things ended between us on a very bitter note and I'm sorry, but it was until I really got the chance to thoroughly think things through, did I realize it was for the best," she said. "And I may still be a little hurt by it, but I also realized that you are a good man for putting your responsibilities first. I really respect that," she exclaimed, taking a different course of action to convince the man. Matthew pondered on her words and stood there in indecision. Maybe he was thinking too far ahead of himself with the whole matter, he thought. "Look, I'll get back to you on that," he told her truthfully. He was not in a decision-making mode. He was still trying to find a way to stop Kaylyn from working. "Okay, Matthew. Talk to you later," came Catherine's voice, and Matthew almost jumped after realizing the woman was still on the phone. "Yes, sure," he said before disconnecting. Matthew released a heavy sigh, twirling the phone in his hand, while biting on his bottom lip as he thought. A grin broke his face, and he immediately dialed Jason's number. "Hey man, what's up?" Jason answered. "Can we meet for a drink later this evening?" Matthew asked eagerly. "Yeah, sure." "What time?" he asked flatly. 6:30, Matthew provided. "Okay, good," he agreed, and Matthew smiled, disconnecting the call. Kaylyn took one glance at herself in the mirror and sighed, her nervousness taking a toll on her even though she had not even arrived at the office. Fidgeting with her fingers, she wondered if she looked all right for the first day. A doubtful frown smeared her face as she glanced down at the knee-length pencil skirt and the long-sleeved top. She really needed face input in the matter. Sighing in frustration, Kaylyn muttered a small curse as she caught her hair in a ponytail. Maybe letting it out loose on the first day wasn't a wise choice, she thought. "Kaylyn, are you okay?" a small, groggy voice asked, and Kaylyn spun around so fast, she had to quickly balance herself to prevent a fall. Plastering a fake and nervous smile on her face, she answered. "Yeah." Sapphire moved from the bed and went to stand beside her, while Kaylyn continued to look in the mirror. Sapphire exclaimed, scratching her chin as a sign of concentration. Kaylyn chuckled, folding her lips as she allowed the little girl to examine her before giving her opinion. "You look really pretty," she grinned, looking up at Kaylyn, who smiled, ruffling Sapphire's hair. "You really think so?" she asked, still unsure. "Yup," she nodded. "But," she said quickly after, and Kaylyn pouted. "Wait here, I have something that will make you look better," she said in excitement, and before Kaylyn could form a reply, she dashed from the room. Kaylyn smiled, wondering what that would possibly be. She smoothed her skirt and brushed in a few strands of loose hair before Sapphire came bolting into the room, her hands behind her. "Close your eyes," she grinned, and Kaylyn chuckled lightly, doing as she said. She only felt something entangling her wrist, leaving her with an idea of what it was. Chapter 20. Kaylyn moved downstairs, with Sapphire skipping behind cheerfully. She immediately went towards the door quickly so she could leave before Matthew could give her another lecture. As soon as her fingers reached the doorknob, she paused upon hearing Matthew's voice. She cringed inwardly. "Where are you going?" he asked, and Kaylyn rolled her eyes before turning. "I thought we already had this conversation," she sighed in frustration. "You haven't had breakfast," he pointed out ruefully. "I will grab something on my way," she told him. Of course she knew that she hadn't eaten, she was feeling ravenous for Christ's sake, but she didn't want to be in the man's presence for even a second. "No, you will eat here." "I've already prepared breakfast," Matthew retorted steely, his gaze narrowed. Kaylyn's eyebrows rose at that. Matthew Mayhew prepared breakfast? She found that hard to believe, but it gave her another reason to leave. She didn't want to fall sick by the man's cooking. "No thanks," she quickly said. Matthew raked his fingers through his hair in frustration. "Are you forgetting the baby?" Kaylyn froze, and before her lips could part to form words, she heard a small gasp. "What baby?" Sapphire squealed, looking from Matthew to Kaylyn repeatedly, with a questioning look on her face. Kaylyn gave Matthew a "look what you've done" glare, but he simply bent on his knees, with a faint smile on his face. He held Sapphire's small hands in his and cleared his throat. "Pumpkin, Kaylyn's going to have a baby," he announced softly, and Sapphire's small mouth fell open as she spun to glance at Kaylyn in disbelief. Kaylyn offered a smile, not sure what the child's reaction to the news would be like. "A baby?" she exclaimed, moving slowly to Kaylyn. Kaylyn nodded, momentarily glancing at Matthew, who had a proud smile on his face. "Will she be my sister?" Already confirming the gender, Sapphire glanced at Matthew. He nodded, and she squealed in excitement, running towards Kaylyn and hugging her legs. "I wanted a baby sister for so long," she murmured against her legs, and Kaylyn laughed heartily, patting her back. "When will she come?" she asked a moment later, staring up at Kaylyn with joy in her eyes. "Couple months," Kaylyn told her, and her face slightly fell, but then she grinned. "Such long time, but I'll have time to get ready," she announced, and Kaylyn smiled, holding her hands as she moved in the direction of the kitchen, deciding to have breakfast after all. She spent 15 minutes eating, with Sapphire being the only one to talk. Her excitement about the baby was so contagious that even Kaylyn found herself quite ecstatic about the prospect of the baby. Sapphire spoke of what she would get when it arrived, speaking as if the baby was an order they had to wait for. She spoke of names, which Kaylyn and Matthew ignored, because the names of her favorite food and toys would not suit. After breakfast, Matthew and Sapphire watched as Kaylyn exited the house. Matthew had decided not to argue with her today, because he knew what he had planned. "Come on, Pumpkin. It's time to get you ready for school." Jason sat in his office, just about ready to start work, when he heard a knock at his door. He figured it to be Kaylyn, and boy, was he eagerly expecting her arrival. He had waited days for this. Days to see her face. And the day had come when he would revel from the long wait. "Come in," he said too eagerly, and when the door opened and he saw a beautiful face peek around, he smiled. "It's safe," he reassured, and watched as Kaylyn fully came into the office. He sighed upon seeing her, her presence like a breath of fresh air to him. She looked very well rested and refreshed this morning, Jason realized, and that only seemed to add to her already striking beauty. He stood, moving around his table to greet her. "Welcome to Felix Enterprises," he announced with an outstretched hand. She smiled, and Jason couldn't help smiling too. "Thank you," she said, placing her hand in his. Jason held it firmly, the softness of her slender hand in his, like a massage to his palm. He realized that he held her hands in his for longer than was necessary, so he quickly pulled his apart, clearing his throat to prevent the impending awkwardness. "So, I'm guessing you passed a very neat and polished desk on the outside of this office," he stated, and Kaylyn nodded. "Yes, I did." "Well, from today onwards, that desk belongs to you. I think you already know what your job entails, and so I want you to perform to the best of your abilities and you will be rewarded," he smiled, before moving to his desk, although not wanting to because he was enthralled by sweet scent of her perfume and the peachy fragrance of her hair. "You may have a seat, Miss Fisher," he announced, gesturing to the empty chair that was in front. Kaylyn did so, placing her hands in her lap with a straight posture. "There are certain rules I expect my employees to follow while working for me. I believe in a free-flowing business, and there are some things I want to be kept out of the working environment." He paused, leaning back in his chair. "There is to be no fraternization in the workplace, and as you know, this is a place of business, and should be considered as such. No personal issues should get in the way of work," Jason pointed out in his most businesslike tone, and Kaylyn continued to listen as he spoke of the don'ts. She sat there listening for about 20 minutes, which she found quite exhausting. The man spoke so highly of his business that Kaylyn then knew why he was so successful. The pride he took in listing every single achievement was so evident that she had to smile. Yes, so I think that's all. Are we clear? He asked with the cocking of a brow, and Kaylyn nodded her head in understanding. Yes, sir, she smiled, and he too smiled, as he got up from around his chair. I believe we will develop a good working relationship here at Felix Enterprises, he exclaimed confidently, stretching forth his hand for another handshake, although his aim was not to seal the agreement, but instead, he did it so he could once again feel the slender softness of Kaylyn's hands. You may return to your desk. I have some work I'd like you to do. It's not much, so don't worry, he reassured her, in regards to her pregnancy. I think I'll be able to manage any amount you hand me, she told him truthfully, not wanting to be excused or treated differently because of her current state. I like that, he nodded his head in approval as he stared unblinkingly at Kaylyn. Kaylyn suddenly cleared her throat when she thought it to be too awkward for him to be staring at her in such a manner. Well, I better get working, she smiled once more before she exited the room. Jason watched every single movement of her body, until the door closed, preventing his devouring eyes from seeing more. He smiled contentedly and then moved around his desk, where he plopped down in his seat, with his hand behind his head. He felt like a lucky man at the moment, because the face he had fallen in admiration for, and the body he had fallen in lust with, was to be the pleasure for his eyes to feast upon every day. Jason wondered how Matthew had managed to leave the beauty out of his sight for 1 second. If it were him, he'd have her at his house, never leaving his side. Her physical appearance was not the only beautiful thing she possessed, but Jason could see from her smile that it was the window to an even more beautiful soul. Matthew was clearly not a family man, Jason thought. He would probably live up to his responsibility by providing for the woman and child financially, but that was all. It had still come as a shock to Jason upon finding that Matthew Mayhew, his engaged friend, was to be the father of Kaylyn's unborn child. Jason couldn't help feeling a spark of envy trickle down his body. He had often thought about what it would be like if it were his child resting in the comfort of a goddess's body. He had often thought about many things that some would consider too sinful, but he realized that it probably wasn't too late for him. If Matthew didn't want to face up to his responsibilities, he'd be the man for the job. A grin broke Jason's face as he thought of the prospect.